The Middle East is aflame, yet again. And yet again, we know there have been wars being fought in the last decades. You go back to not just 1948, 1967, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, then the Intifadas, the Lebanese War, everything in between, over and under, including the terrorist attacks. I mentioned Intifada. And then finally now, this latest, the world calls October 7th, the barbaric atrocities perpetrated by Hamas on over 1,200 innocent men, women, and children, and then the ensuing war that is still being fought and raging in Gaza. What lies at the heart, at the root of this conflict? Ask most people, and they do not know. There's all kinds of excuses and propaganda being perpetuated. But what really lies at the heart of it? Because it did not begin in 1948. There were pogroms in Hebron and Jerusalem long before the state of Israel was established. And if you go back in history, you see very clearly. I mean, you don't need to look more than just look at the old city of Jerusalem. Why are there 4 quarters in the old city? One is called the Jewish quarter. One is called the Christian quarter. One is called the Muslim quarter. One is called the Armenian quarter. How the Armenians get there is another discussion. The 3 major religions have been battling and fighting over the control of the promised land, the holy land of the Bible, for time immemorial. You go all the way back to biblical times, there were battles being fought. Even when God promised the land to Abraham and his family, you see a little while later the Jewish people with Jacob go down to Egypt due to a famine. And then when they return after a long slavery of hundreds of years, the land has been occupied by locals and refused to return the land to its rightful owners. Who are the rightful owners? The children of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that everybody knew the land was promised to. Not only that, Abraham purchased land in Hebron. And it was very clear. So beginning from that, and even after the Jews settled, so yes, they lived there peacefully for a while, with wars being fought, built the first temple, which a few hundred years later was destroyed by the Babylonians, who then took control of the land. 70 years later, the second temple was built. And again, a period of time that the Jews controlled the land. And that too, ultimately, was destroyed by the Romans. With, in between, a story with the Persians, with the Greeks, with the Syrians. And after the Romans destroyed the second temple and the Jews were sent off into exile, the battles did not stop. We know the Crusades trying to control Jerusalem. And then 6 centuries later came the Muslims and the wars with the Muslims, to the point that the Ottoman Empire and many derivatives controlled that piece of land. Until the 20th century, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the British mandate, the British taking over that part of the land. So you have a history that goes back literally thousands of years. I should mention that none other than the commentary Rashi, Rab Shlomo Yitzchaki, 1,000 years ago, cites a medrash, right at the beginning of the Bible, where it says, God created heaven and earth. Why does the Torah begin, the Bible begin with the story of God creating heaven and earth? So he says, in order to respond to the argument that people will say, the nations of the world will say to the Jews, listimatem, you're thieves, you've stolen this land from us. Can you imagine? We're talking about over 1,000 years ago. And counting the Medrash even longer. So this argument was there from the beginning and continues to dominate headlines, this to this very day. And that's why They respond that God says, tell them I created earth. And I gave it to the people, to the Jewish people. I gave it to the nations of the world, and I took a part of it and gave it to the Jewish people. That's the response. So when you see an area, a region, where battles have been raging on and on and on, and especially when you cannot find any ostensible reason, as in, is it a war over resources, over land, money, ego, power, then you have to understand that there's something deeper going on. And indeed, it's a small land, but its potency, the Holy Land, the Promised Land, in the words of Jacob, the gate to heaven, the bridge and interface between heaven and earth. Who doesn't want control over that? So to find the answer, let us go back to events that happened 3,336 years ago. Exactly. In the Hebrew year from creation, 2,448, was the greatest watershed moment called the revelation at Sinai. Matan Torah in Hebrew. In a few days from now, next week, we will be celebrating the holiday of Shavuot, which is the 3,336th anniversary of that great event. What happened there? If we can understand the events then and its impact at the time and into posterity, perpetually, into all of history, we can find answers to our most important questions. And above all, not just to understand the root of the conflict, but to understand the solution. Because when you can get to the root and not just the symptoms, that helps you remedy it from the core. So briefly, the story is this. After, as I mentioned, a several centuries old enslavement and bondage of the Jewish people and a genocide at the hands of the Egyptians, the Jews finally, in the famous exodus from Egypt, leave Egypt. 49 days they travel, and on the 50th day of that very year, they arrive at Mount Sinai. Well, I should say they arrive a few days earlier. But 50 days from the leaving of Egypt, they receive God's mandate, what we call the Torah, the Bible. And then begins another 40-year journey from Sinai to the Promised Land. What is this Torah? What was the significance of this event? So the Bible tells us. And with the support and explanation of the oral sages' interpretation of the events that happened then, that up till that point, till Sinai, there was a schism. There was a fundamental dissonance and separation between heaven and earth, between spirit and matter, or you could want to call it energy and matter. That which was material belonged to the material world. That which was spiritual belonged to the spiritual world. And therefore there was an inherent tension between the two, as there is now as well. But here's what happened. At Sinai, it says the divine God entered into the realm of the material existence. That doesn't mean he wasn't there before, but it means he became present. And the material existence elevated, and the two met. Basically, the original E equals MC squared, where matter and energy, matter and spirit, can now be fused. They're not two separate domains. There is no duality. That with our hard work, Sinai empowers us to relieve the tension between matter and spirit, not by escaping into spirit through ascetic lifestyle, and not by indulging in material life and seeing spirituality as something outside of us, but a total fusion of the two. And how do you relieve the tension? By spiritualizing the material world. So Sinai empowered us to take our very physical existence, our bodies, our food, our drink, our sleep, our work, everything in this physical world and tap into it to reveal and release the potent, powerful spiritual energy that lies within. If you want an example, yes, it's an example of, you can call it fission or fusion of subatomic particles to release tremendous energy that lies within atoms. But unless you really dig deep, or with tremendous pressure and heat to split the atom or to fuse, fusion or fission, that energy stays in a dormant and potential state. The equivalent on the spiritual end is that we, through our work and our commitment to not live materialistic lives as an end in itself, but directed toward higher purpose, toward service. So instead of living a life of self-interest, driven by self-interest, a life of giving, of virtue, of love, that's how we transform a selfish material and a narcissistic material world into a beautiful garden, into a home for the divine. That's the power that Sinai gave us. And that's why, indeed, right after Sinai comes the commandment to build a temple. Take your material world, take gold, silver, and copper, and turn it into a sanctuary, a divine home. Which by extension means that right now, as we speak, each one of us has been empowered with the ability to take our homes, our work, our vacations, our free time, all our interactions, all our experiences, and turn it into a divine environment. That's the purpose of existence. From the beginning of time. The longer discussion why it took generations, why was the Torah, why was Sinai not happen right at the beginning of creation? Briefly, because in a sense like education, the world had to prepare itself. So Adam and Eve, and then the generations afterwards, with their setbacks, but ultimately with an Abraham and an Isaac and a Jacob and the Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs, they prepared the ground. They were the pioneers. And once they laid the ground and they introduced into the world a new path, instead of selfish paganism and dog eats dog and survival of the fittest and the selfish gene ideology, instead of the id, Freudian and the id and Darwinian survival of the fittest, social Darwinism. Instead of that, a very different approach that life is about giving, not about taking. It's about selflessness, not about selfishness. It's a mission-centric life, not a survival-centric one. So they laid the ground to the point that 26 generations from the time of Adam and Eve later, in the year 2448, as I mentioned, Sinai took place. That ultimately gave that power, forever now, to transform the very material world. So you think of it very practically, you'll see in different schools of thought, there are those that argue, matter and spirit cannot be brought together. They're two different forces. One is driven by self-interest, greed. Think of capitalism. And spirituality is driven by giving, by being less of self. As a matter of fact, some of the idealists, the ideology that so attracted people to socialism, rooted in Marxism, was exactly that. It's not about greed, it's not about private property, it's not about you. There's a collective good. However, the only problem was it didn't work, because there is a self that needs to be addressed. So all thinkers say there's a inherent dichotomy and tension and tenuousness, or worse, even hostility, between a material-driven life and a spiritual-driven life. So there are those, as I mentioned earlier, that choose the life of asceticism. The only way to really reach those deeper truths is to cut yourself off as much as possible from the material drive, from the rush hour of the Wall Street marketplace. The dog eats dog, the competitiveness, the greed, the profit-making environment of business, of the business world. Others say, take for example, Calvinism, the Protestant work ethic, that engage with the world and be ethical. But however, you're not going to be able to reach necessarily the deepest spiritual levels. That's for certain individuals. Then, of course, there's the approach of just being a material human being and from time to time try to have some virtue. I mean, capitalism did get tamed and did adapt certain sensitivities, because pure hardcore capitalism can be very harsh. In Marx's words, the alienation it creates. So capitalism has incorporated workers' rights, compensation, unions, charity, rewarding charity. But there always remains that tension. Comes Sinai and says there's a third approach, that the divine, God, is neither matter nor spirit, and therefore they can be fused as one. Now all this tells us about Sinai. What is its message to us? And above all, why did it create wars and conflicts? So here's an interesting episode. We're told in the Talmud and in different midrashim, which is the oral tradition, that before God gave the Torah at Sinai, he approached the nations of the world, and namely, he approached the children of Esav, the children of Yishmael, before he came to the children of Israel. But let's first a little background. Who are these individuals? Esav was the son of Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah had twin boys, Jacob and Esav. Jacob would become the ancestor of the Jewish people. Esav would become the ancestor of the Roman Western Christian world. His grandson was called Rome. A generation before that, Abraham also had two children, Isaac and Yishmael, or in the order, Yishmael and Isaac. Yishmael would become later an ancestor of the Arab Muslim world. And Isaac, of course, was the father of Jacob, ancestor of the Jewish people. Abraham is the father of all nations, the ancestor of all of them. So here you have three players. The Jews that originate from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Christians, you could say the Western Roman world, that originates from Esav. And the Ishmaelites, the Arab Muslims that originate from Yishmael. All children of Abraham. And Abraham was the one that introduced the principles that laid the ground for Sinai. So it makes total sense. Then when it came to Sinai, even though it was 7 generations from Abraham, that God would turn to Abraham's children and offer them this mandate. Here is the mandate that your grandfather, your great-grandfather, Abraham, had embraced. So I'm offering it to you. So what happened? The children of Esav said, let's see what it says in the Torah. They rejected it. They couldn't accept its rules, or some of its rules. Because to them, it went against their nature. Their nature was, Esav was a warrior. The Torah the Torah commands that you shall not kill. You have to be refined. They were not ready for it yet. The children of Yishmael looked into the Torah, the same thing, they rejected it. For similar reasons, different reasons, but the same idea. It was too much for them. Even though it was what they had heard from their great-grandfather. Come to the children of Israel, who had just gone through tremendous trauma in the Egyptian exile, and they accepted it. So the obvious question is, why did God offer it to them? Didn't he not know that they would not accept it? What was the point of offering it? And let's say they had accepted it. What would they have done then? Say to the Jews, you know what? Hey, I've already given the Torah to someone else. So there are different answers offered. The one I will share is from the Zohar, a mystical explanation. The actual explanation is not mystical, but it's from mystical sources. God offering it to them began softening them and preparing them to one day embrace it. But perhaps not ready yet at the time. The Jews were ready to embrace the principles. Which principles? Of charity, of virtue. And I'll use language that would later be embraced by the Christian United States of America. all men are created equal, that every human being is created in the divine image and therefore has absolute rights, inalienable rights endowed by the Creator. The Christians and the Muslims, or we'll say the children of Esav and Yishmael, were not ready at the time. That's why the world, there was no such thing as freedom or rights. Until 250 years ago, the United States, the first country that institutionalized the Bill of Rights, the essential freedoms, all the values we cherish today, is only 2.5 centuries old. But the Jewish people embraced it in the Torah. It was always in the Torah. But then it took time, and what happened? Generations afterwards, a few thousand years, so we're talking now 1,000 years later, approximately, Christianity was born. Where? In Rome. Well, actually, it was born in Israel, to be honest. But Rome embraced it, and then it became a world religion. After Constantine, it became Christian. And from there it spread. So the children of Esav, of Rome, ultimately began to embrace the principles that were given at Sinai, that were first taught by Abraham. So you see the events all connect to each other. 7 generations later, Muhammad, Islam was born. Where? In the Arab world, the children of Yishmael, embracing these teachings as well, albeit in a different way. But the essential teachings always begin with the Bible, with Moses, the first prophet, and going back to Abraham, the first pioneer of monotheism, and all the values that it espouses. So you see that the events at Sinai impacted the world at the time, but it took time till it took hold. But here's the big important caveat. When you embrace a higher order, a spiritual order of higher consciousness, and then you're faced with the material world, there's always going to be tension and difficulty. Even though we have the power to fuse them, but it doesn't come easily, because the material world tugs at us. It seduces us. It pulls at us. Look at us. Each of us have 2 voices. We have the voice of my selfish needs, me, and the voice of altruism. And there's a battle going on between the two, so beautifully documented in the book called the Tanya. It's a battle. We have the power to win this battle. We have the power to fuse the two, but it's still a battle. So what happens? Christianity doesn't just embrace it in a peaceful way. By the sword, goes to war. War against Jews, war against pagans, war against anyone that did not embrace its policies, to the point that it may be lost sight of the compassion and the benevolence and the love that Abraham had and that Sinai taught. And it took years, as I said, it took many years for Christianity to be tamed, to finally embrace it in a peaceful way. The United States of America was the first example, and from there it was imported and became today the standard, not of all countries, but it continues to grow. Principles that are now institutionalized, the respect of people's rights, the respect and the freedoms that we inherently have. And hence the virtue that life is not just about me. It's not just a battle between tribes and whoever is more powerful wins. The world is not controlled by monarchs and tyrants. There are free elections. I'm not saying there isn't corruption. I'm not saying there aren't problems. But the values, the principles have become part and parcel of mainstream thinking. And that was unheard of, if you look back. We take it for granted, but that was unheard of. But not those that were at Sinai. They always knew. And they always believed, and they knew that it would ultimately affect the entire world, including the children of Esav. And the same thing with Islam. Initially, and even till this day, especially fundamental radical Islam, continues to be violent. I'm not saying they're all violent. I'm not saying every Muslim is a violent person, everyone's a terrorist, but unfortunately all terrorists are Muslim or from that part of the world. It has not yet had the market correction, for lack of a better word, of being tamed to realize to bring God to this world does not require destroying and killing infidels, even if they are infidels. It's to learn from Abraham that you pray for the wicked people of Sodom if you consider them wicked. You inspire them. In other words, the Torah method, the Sinai method, was to bring godliness to this world, but in a beautiful way, in an inspiring way, not through war. So though the children of Ishmael and the children of Esav did embrace ultimately, or the other way around, the children of Esav and the children of Ishmael ultimately embraced Torah principles, but it took time for the Christians and the children of Esav to realize that it has to be done with a heart and soul, and with respect for every person. Even a person has the freedom of religion. They even have a right to choose to be an atheist. Inspire, educate, bring light through love, not through war. And definitely not the war of that controls and tries to dominate over others. Islam's virtues, the virtues in the Quran, fundamentally are very biblical. However, there is jihad and the call for even violence and the destruction of your enemies, seeing them as infidels, whether it's what they like to call the Judeo-Christian, or they call the Judeo-Crusade, the Zionist crusade conspiracy. Why are those words used by Muslim radicals? What Crusader and Zionism? The Crusaders fought against the Jews, but they see them both as enemies, and they have to go to war. Sinai says, no, it has to be done with a soul, with love, with heart. So I have no question, no doubt that Islam will also come to the same terms just as Christianity did, because God did ultimately offer the Torah to the children of Ishmael, to the Arab Muslim world, as he offered it to the Roman Western, ultimately Christian world. So Sinai's message to us cannot be more relevant. It's telling us, by all means, bring God to the world. Don't cut God out. Don't allow the dichotomy that some tried to espouse between what the Enlightenment pushed and advocated between faith and science. They complement each other. But their complementation has to be peaceful. They both need each other. You need faith, you need religion, you need spirituality for moral guidance, for moral direction. Science on its own, the material world on its own, no matter how brilliant it is amoral, is neutral. And on the other hand, faith and religion that doesn't have a balance of reason can become radical, can become crazy, can become zealotry to the point of destruction. We all understand that. Sinai said, fuse the two. And that's why it took time. Abraham taught that principle. But not all his children picked up all the details. They picked up the general picture. So Sinai offered all the nations of the world, namely the ones we're discussing, this formula. And it took time for them to embrace the formula. But then the time had come. Firstly for the children of Esav. And now the time has come for the children of Ishmael. That's what we should be advocating. We'll teach them about Sinai. Again, in a kind way, not in a condescending way. What are the true principles that your great-grandfather Abraham taught and that Sinai ratified? So though the Jewish people did receive the Torah, but it wasn't just for them. It was a universal divine mandate for the entire world. The Jews were the caretakers, the teachers, if you wish, the people of the book. That's why there's an obligation on the Jewish people not just to advocate and to teach their own children and families the divine laws, but also to teach the world the universal divine laws of civilization, sometimes referred to as the 7 Noahide laws, the universal laws that keep a world from becoming a jungle and turning it into a garden, a world that is driven by morality and by ethics and by decency, again, by the principles that much of the Western world has embraced, and other parts of the world as well. That is the mandate of Sinai. So it's 3,336 years later, but it lives on and relevant today more than ever. If I had my say, this should be the dominant headlines in every newspaper and every media outlet, all the social media. Not just the reporting of the news and all the politics and the polarization and the lies and the propaganda, but the big picture. This is what leaders should be coming out and saying. You want to have a blueprint for peace? A blueprint for the future? Let us embrace Sinai. Re-embrace it. And it was offered to all of us. And it was given to all of us. It's not exclusive to anyone. That's why God gave it at Sinai. Has it yet completely transformed the world into a perfect world? Obviously not. But it has a blueprint. It has given us the ability. And indeed, it has changed the world. There's no question it's transformed the world. Even non-believers, so to speak, even though I don't know if there's such a thing, Steven Pinker has a great book where he talks about, and he brings all the statistics of the trajectory of history. How it's all going down, violence, war, justice and virtue going up, becoming more and more popular. The battles are not over. Freedom House documents the countries in this world that are considered free, semi-free, and those that are not. And you'll see also the trajectory, becoming more freer, embracing more of these universal laws, divine laws of civilization. And essentially at the heart of it all is that God created every human being in the divine image, and everyone has an indispensable mission, and no one has a right to compromise another person's freedoms and rights. And then there are obligations to the divine, that we are accountable to a higher force, obligation not to hurt others, not to kill others, not to steal, protection of people's possessions and property and money, sexual health, protecting the environment and the animals and the world around us, and to establish laws, a system of laws and justice. These are the 7 Noahide laws. If you want more information on it, I have it in my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, in the chapter on government. And in general, the themes I've discussed here are themes that I have discussed in the past, but obviously, today the emphasis is on the events happening now. So if you look at the picture of history, it informs us not just the roots of the issue, but also the solutions. It's about embracing the Sinai formula. That's what it comes down to. And that's the key to all the tensions. People talk about AI and technology, where that's headed. It's essentially about how we can bridge the success of a material, prosperous world and all its advancements and breathtaking advancements, and not become apathetic and not lose our souls. Not only not lose our souls, fuse our souls within our technologies, within our businesses, within our material lives. The more successful we are, the more money is made, the more necessary it is, that message. And in the words of Maimonides, what is the ultimate result of Sinai? What will be in the near future is a new spiritual revolution, where the world will be dominated. The whole business of the world, as Maimonides puts it, will be only to advance and grow with higher spiritual consciousness and awareness. Materialism will be a means towards spiritual growth. And the words of Isaiah, the prophet, no more evil, no more destruction. Why? Because the world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. Not just knowledge, divine knowledge, refined knowledge, spiritual knowledge, knowledge that is not just how to build better machines and how to make more money, but a knowledge that knows how to take all the knowledge of the world and direct it toward a higher end, a higher purpose of refining this world and turning it into a divine sanctuary, a divine home, a divine garden. That's the mandate of Sinai. And 3,336 years later, relevant today more than ever. We're not naive. We understand there are battles to be fought. There are enemies, there are people who are sworn enemies, and everything I said now, we may not even listen to. But I believe there are enough of us that would listen to this message. So we have to keep advocating it. And through that ripple butterfly effect, reach more and more of the critical mass. And those that refuse and continue to resist the ultimate Sinai message, the ultimate Abraham message, let them be isolated. Let it be clear who they are. And either they will see the light, or they will have to accept defeat because of their aggression and their violence and their atrocities. But let the rest of us, all of us, that are level-headed and thinking, embrace the mandate of Sinai. If not now, when? Thank you so much. This has been Simon Jacobson, Meaningful Life Center. MeaningfulLife.com is our website. As I pointed out, many of these themes can be found at our site. Just do a search about Sinai, its message to the Jews, to the Christians, to the Muslims 3,336 years later. Please subscribe to our offerings. We have different subscription lists to our growing YouTube channel. And please share. Love to hear your feedback, your thoughts, your comments. Be blessed. May Sinai shine forth to every corner of the world, to the children of Israel, to the children of Esav, to the children of Ishmael, and to all our cousins and children everywhere in the world, that ultimately we all have the common ancestor of Abraham, and before that, Adam and Eve. Be blessed and be well.
This program is brought to you by the Meaningful Life Center. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at meaningfullife.com/donate.